The silver moonlight cast ghostly shadows across the captain's quarters as Lionel Jones lay motionless in his hammock, his breathing deliberately slow and measured. Through barely opened eyes, he watched Emma Evans move carefully through the dimly lit cabin, her swollen belly making each step a careful calculation. She believed him to be deep in sleep, exhausted from the day's brutal encounter with the naval patrol that had nearly claimed his ship and crew. What she didn't know was that he had been feigning slumber for the past hour, testing something that had been gnawing at his conscience for weeks. Emma's pregnancy had become impossible to hide, her condition growing more apparent with each passing day aboard the Crimson Serpent. The other crew members whispered behind her back, some with concern, others with barely concealed resentment. A pregnant woman on a pirate ship was considered the worst kind of luck, a burden that could endanger them all. Lionel had heard the murmurs, seen the sideways glances, felt the tension building like storm clouds on the horizon. Tonight, he needed to know where Emma's loyalties truly lay. The young woman moved with surprising grace despite her condition, her bare feet silent against the wooden planks. She approached his desk where charts and navigational instruments lay scattered, evidence of their hasty escape from Port Royal's waters. Lionel's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched her pause, her hand hovering over the leather-bound logbook that contained every secret of his operations, every hidden cache of treasure, every safe harbor they had used over the years. This was the moment of truth. Emma had been aboard his ship for 8 months now, taken during a raid on a merchant vessel where she had served as a lady's companion to a wealthy colonial family. Unlike the other captives they had ransomed or released, something about Emma had made Lionel hesitate. Perhaps it was the defiant fire in her green eyes, or the way she had stood protectively in front of the younger servants when his men had boarded. Whatever the reason, he had kept her aboard, initially as a servant but gradually as something more complicated. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Emma's fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the logbook. Lionel held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. If she opened that book, if she tried to memorize their routes or steal information to sell to the authorities, it would confirm his worst fears. The crew's suspicions would be justified, and he would have no choice but to treat her as the spy they believed her to be. The thought sent a cold dread through his chest that had nothing to do with the cool night air drifting through the cabin's windows. But Emma didn't open the logbook. Instead, she moved away from the desk and toward the small wooden chest where Lionel kept his personal belongings. Her movements were careful, almost reverent, as she lifted the lid with practiced silence. Lionel's confusion deepened as he watched her reach inside, not to steal, but to retrieve something she had apparently hidden there herself. The object in Emma's hands caught the moonlight, revealing itself to be a small piece of cloth, carefully folded and worn soft with handling. As she unfolded it, Lionel recognized it as a piece of fabric torn from her original dress, the fine blue silk gown she had worn during the raid. She had kept this scrap all these months, and now she was using it for something that made Lionel's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Emma moved to the small mirror mounted on the cabin wall and began to tie the fabric around her hair, creating a simple but elegant headband that transformed her appearance. The moonlight seemed to favor her in that moment, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek, the determined set of her jaw, the protective way her free hand rested on her swollen belly. She was preparing herself for something, but what? The answer came as Emma turned toward the corner of the cabin where a small shrine had been erected. It wasn't a Christian altar, but rather a collection of personal items that held meaning for various crew members who had lost loved ones at sea. Lionel had allowed its creation months ago, understanding that even the hardest pirates needed something to believe in when facing the endless dangers of their chosen life. Emma knelt before the shrine with some difficulty, her pregnancy making the movement awkward and clearly painful. But she persevered, reaching into the folds of her simple servant's dress to produce a small object that Lionel couldn't quite make out in the dim light. As she placed it carefully among the other offerings, he realized what he was witnessing. This was a ritual of protection, a prayer for safe passage. Emma was not plotting against him or his crew. She was praying for them. The small object she had placed on the shrine appeared to be a simple wooden carving, perhaps a ship or a bird, something she had crafted herself during the long hours when she thought no one was watching. The realization hit Lionel like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the depth of his own suspicions and the unfairness of his test. Emma's lips moved silently as she knelt before the shrine, her words too quiet for Lionel to hear, but her intention clear in every line of her posture. She was asking for protection, not just for herself and her unborn child, but for the ship and crew that had become her unlikely family. The pirates who had taken her from her old life had somehow, impossibly, become the people she now sought to shield with her prayers. The irony was not lost on Lionel. Here he had been, testing her loyalty while she demonstrated it in the most profound way possible. She could have been planning their destruction, selling their secrets, or preparing her escape. Instead, she was kneeling in prayer for their safety, offering what little she had to whatever gods might listen to the desperate pleas of a pregnant woman aboard a pirate ship. As Emma struggled to rise from her kneeling position, Lionel found himself fighting the urge to leap from his hammock and assist her. The sight of her difficulty, combined with the revelation of her true feelings, created a protective instinct so strong it nearly overwhelmed his need to maintain the pretense of sleep. But he forced himself to remain still, knowing that this moment of truth was too important to interrupt. Emma finally managed to stand, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other still resting protectively on her belly. She stood before the shrine for a long moment, her head bowed in what appeared to be a final prayer. When she finally turned away, Lionel saw tears glistening on her cheeks, silver tracks in the moonlight that spoke of fears and hopes too deep for words. The pregnant woman made her way back toward the door of the cabin, moving with the same careful silence she had maintained throughout her midnight ritual. But as she reached for the handle, she paused and turned back toward Lionel's hammock. For a terrifying moment, he thought she had discovered his deception, that she knew he had been watching her private moment of devotion. Instead, Emma approached his sleeping form with the gentle care of someone tending to a loved one. She reached out with one hand, not to wake him, but to adjust the thin blanket that had slipped from his shoulders during his pretense of restless sleep. Her touch was feather-light, barely there, but it sent shockwaves through Lionel's entire being. "Sleep well, Captain," Emma whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible even in the quiet cabin. "Tomorrow will bring new dangers, and we'll need your strength to see us through." The tenderness in her voice, the genuine concern for his well-being, completed the transformation of Lionel's understanding. This woman, whom he had suspected of betrayal, was instead showing him a care and loyalty that few in his violent world had ever offered. She saw him not as the feared pirate captain that others knew, but as a man who carried the weight of many lives on his shoulders, a man who deserved rest and protection just as much as he provided it for others. After Emma left the cabin, Lionel remained motionless in his hammock for several long minutes, processing what he had witnessed. The test he had devised had revealed far more about himself than about Emma. His suspicions had been born not of evidence, but of fear. Fear that something good in his life was too good to be true, too pure to last in the harsh reality of his chosen existence. The months leading up to this night played through his memory like scenes from a vivid dream. Emma's arrival on his ship had been violent and traumatic, as most encounters with pirates tended to be. The merchant vessel they had raided was carrying a wealthy colonial family back to England, along with their servants and a considerable amount of gold intended for investment in London banks. It should have been a routine operation: take the gold, ransom the wealthy passengers, and release the servants at the next port. But Emma had changed everything. When his men had burst into the passenger cabin, weapons drawn and faces masked, most of the occupants had screamed and cowered as expected. Emma, however, had immediately positioned herself between the pirates and a young maid who couldn't have been more than 14. Despite her obvious terror, she had stood her ground, her chin raised in defiance, her green eyes blazing with a courage that had stopped Lionel in his tracks. "Take what you want," she had said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "But leave the girl alone. She's done nothing to deserve your anger." It had been such an unexpected display of selflessness that Lionel had found himself studying Emma more closely than was wise. Most people in her situation would have been concerned only with their own survival, but she was thinking of others even in the face of mortal danger. It was a quality so rare in his experience that it had intrigued him immediately. The ransom negotiations for the wealthy family had proceeded normally, but when it came time to release the servants, Lionel had made an impulsive decision that he still couldn't fully explain. Instead of putting Emma ashore with the others, he had offered her a choice: remain aboard his ship as a paid servant, or take her chances in a foreign port with no money and no connections. At the time, he had told himself it was a practical decision. His ship needed someone with Emma's obvious education and refinement to handle correspondence and maintain certain areas of the ship that his rough crew couldn't be trusted with. But looking back now, Lionel knew the truth was more complicated. Something about Emma had called to a part of himself he had thought long dead, a part that remembered what it was like to care about someone other than himself. Emma had accepted his offer, though whether from desperation or genuine choice, Lionel had never been certain. In the weeks that followed, she had proven herself to be everything he had hoped and more. She was intelligent, adaptable, and possessed of a quiet strength that earned the grudging respect even of his most hardened crew members. She never complained about the harsh conditions, never begged to be returned to shore, never showed anything but determination to make the best of her situation. It was Ryan White, his first mate, who had first noticed the signs of Emma's pregnancy. The grizzled sailor had approached Lionel privately one evening, his weathered face creased with concern. "Captain," Ryan had said, his voice low and troubled, "we need to talk about the girl." Lionel had known immediately what Ryan meant. Emma's morning sickness had been impossible to hide in the close quarters of the ship, and her gradually changing figure was becoming apparent even beneath the loose clothing she had taken to wearing. The implications were staggering and potentially catastrophic for ship morale. "How long?" Lionel had asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I'd say 4 months, maybe 5, Ryan had replied, "which means it happened before she came aboard, if you're wondering about that." Lionel had been wondering about that, though he was ashamed to admit it. The timing meant that Emma had been pregnant when they took her from the merchant vessel. Pregnant and alone, and probably terrified about her future even before pirates had entered her life. The father was presumably someone from her previous situation, perhaps a fellow servant or even one of the family members she had worked for. Whoever he was now beyond reach, leaving Emma to face her pregnancy alone in the most dangerous and unsuitable environment imaginable. The crew's reaction to the news had been mixed and troubling. Some of the men viewed a pregnant woman as the worst possible luck, a harbinger of disaster that would surely bring destruction upon them all. Others saw her as a burden they couldn't afford, a mouth to feed who would soon be unable to contribute to the ship's operations. A few, the more superstitious ones, whispered that her child might be cursed, born of violence and destined to bring misfortune to anyone who sheltered it. Only a handful of the crew members had shown any sympathy for Emma's situation. Christopher Williams, the ship's cook, had begun preparing special meals to help with her morning sickness. Raymond Jackson, despite his fearsome reputation in battle, had quietly begun crafting a small cradle from driftwood during his off-duty hours. These small kindnesses had meant everything to Emma, Lionel could see, but they weren't enough to counteract the growing tension among the rest of the crew. The pressure had been building for weeks before Lionel decided to stage his test. Donald Diaz, one of his most trusted crew members, had approached him with concerns that went beyond mere superstition. "Captain," Donald had said during a private conversation in Lionel's cabin, "the men are talking. Some of them think the girl might be working with the authorities, feeding them information about our movements." The suggestion had hit Lionel like a physical blow. "What evidence do they have?" "No evidence, sir, just suspicion, but you know how it is. A pregnant woman shows up on our ship, and suddenly we're having more close calls with naval patrols. Coincidence makes men nervous in our line of work." Lionel had known Donald was right. The past few months had indeed brought more encounters with naval vessels than usual, though Lionel attributed this to increased patrols rather than any betrayal from within. The colonial authorities were cracking down on piracy throughout the Caribbean, deploying more ships and offering larger bounties for the capture of known pirates. It was a natural escalation of their ongoing war, not the result of inside information. But the crew's suspicions were dangerous regardless of their accuracy. If enough men began to believe Emma was a spy, they would demand action. In the brutal democracy of pirate ships, even a captain's authority had limits when the crew's safety was perceived to be at stake. Lionel could protect Emma only as long as he could maintain the fiction that she posed no threat to their operations. The test had seemed like the only way to resolve the situation definitively. If Emma was indeed working with the authorities, she would surely take advantage of what appeared to be a perfect opportunity to gather intelligence. His logbook contained enough information to destroy not just his own operations, but those of several allied pirate captains throughout the region. A spy would find it irresistible. But Emma had proven herself in the most unexpected way possible. Instead of betraying them, she had revealed the depth of her loyalty and concern. The wooden carving she had placed on the shrine was clearly her own work, crafted during the long hours when she thought no one was watching. It represented not just her prayers for their safety, but her investment in their well-being, her genuine desire to see them all survive the dangers that surrounded them daily. The realization of what Emma truly meant to him and to his crew created a new set of problems for Lionel. A pregnant woman aboard a pirate ship was complicated enough, but a pregnant woman who had become emotionally important to the captain was potentially catastrophic. His enemies would see her as a weakness to exploit. His own crew might view his feelings as a dangerous distraction, and Emma herself would become a target for anyone seeking leverage against him. Yet as Lionel lay in his hammock replaying the scene he had just witnessed, he found he didn't care about the complications. Emma's gentle touch as she adjusted his blanket, her whispered words of concern for his well-being, her prayers for their collective safety, all of these revealed a depth of caring that he had never expected to find in his violent world. She had chosen to stand with them, to make that air fate her own, despite having every reason to hate and fear them. The sound of footsteps on the deck above interrupted Lionel's brooding. He recognized the heavy tread of Ryan White making his rounds, checking on the night watch and ensuring the ship's security. Soon it would be dawn, and with it would come new challenges, new decisions about Emma's future, and the growing complications of her pregnancy. Lionel knew he could no longer pretend that Emma was simply a servant who happened to be aboard his ship. She had become something much more significant, something that would require him to make choices he had never anticipated. The crew's concerns about her pregnancy would only intensify as her condition became more advanced. Soon she would be unable to perform even light duties, and the question of what to do when the baby arrived would become urgent. But tonight had changed everything. Emma's demonstration of loyalty and love had transformed her from a potential liability into something precious that needed protection. Lionel found himself thinking not about the problems her pregnancy would create, but about the kind of life he could offer her and her child. Could a pirate ship ever be a home for a family? Could a man like him ever be worthy of the trust and affection Emma had shown? These were questions that would require answers soon, but for now, Lionel was content to lie in his hammock and remember the sight of Emma kneeling in prayer for their safety. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew now that she would face them as one of them, not as an outsider or a threat. That knowledge was worth more than any treasure he had ever captured, more valuable than any prize he had ever claimed. The first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the horizon when Lionel finally allowed himself to drift toward genuine sleep. His last conscious thought was of Emma's gentle touch and whispered words, a benediction that seemed to promise that whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them together. The morning brought with it the harsh realities that Lionel had been dreading. As he emerged from his cabin to address the day's duties, he found his crew gathered in small clusters, their conversations dying abruptly when they noticed his presence. The tension was palpable, a storm brewing that threatened to tear apart the careful balance he had maintained aboard the Crimson Serpent. Ryan White approached him immediately, his weathered face grave with concern. "Captain, we need to talk. The men are restless, and there's been talk during the night watch." Lionel nodded, having expected this confrontation. "My cabin, 5 minutes." As Ryan departed to finish his immediate duties, Lionel's eyes sought out Emma among the crew members beginning their morning tasks. He found her near the ship's rail, hanging laundry with careful, deliberate movements that accommodated her growing belly. She looked pale in the morning light, and he could see the exhaustion that her midnight ritual had cost her. Yet she worked without complaint, maintaining the dignity and strength that had first caught his attention months ago. Several crew members were watching Emma as well, their expressions ranging from concern to suspicion to outright hostility. Lauren Smith, one of the few women among his crew, had positioned herself nearby in what appeared to be a protective gesture. But even Lauren's presence couldn't entirely shield Emma from the weight of the others' stares. When Ryan returned to the cabin, he brought with him Donald Diaz and Christopher Williams, representing different factions among the crew. Their presence told Lionel that this was not going to be a simple conversation, but rather a formal presentation of the crew's concerns. "Speak freely," Lionel commanded, settling into his chair behind the desk where Emma had stood just hours before. Ryan cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Captain, the men are worried. Last night's encounter with that naval patrol was too close, and it's not the first time lately. Some of the crew think there's a reason we keep running into trouble." "And they think Emma is that reason," Lionel stated flatly. "Not all of them," Christopher interjected quickly. "Some of us think she's been nothing but helpful. But there's enough suspicion to cause problems." Donald stepped forward, his expression troubled but determined. "Captain, you know I respect your judgment, but we have to consider the possibility. A pregnant woman appears on our ship, and suddenly our luck turns bad. It's not just superstition anymore. It's a pattern." Lionel studied the three men before him, reading the genuine concern in their faces. These were not mutinous troublemakers, but loyal crew members struggling with a situation that challenged everything they thought they knew about shipboard life. Their fears were not entirely unreasonable, even if they were ultimately unfounded. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lionel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Ryan exchanged glances with the others before responding. "Some of the men want her put ashore at the next port. Others think we should search her belongings, see if she's carrying anything that might be used to signal our position to naval vessels." The suggestion of searching Emma's belongings made Lionel's jaw clench. After what he had witnessed the night before, the idea of violating her privacy and trust felt like a betrayal of everything she had shown him. But he also understood that his crew's concerns needed to be addressed before they festered into something more dangerous. "And if we find nothing?" Lionel asked. "Then we'll know she's not a spy," Donald replied. "But the pregnancy is still a problem, Captain. What happens when the baby comes? What happens if she dies in childbirth? What happens if the child is born sick or deformed? The men see omens in everything, and a dead woman and child aboard the ship would destroy morale completely." The brutal practicality of Donald's words hit Lionel like a physical blow. He had been so focused on Emma's loyalty and his own growing feelings that he had failed to fully consider the practical challenges her pregnancy would create. Childbirth was dangerous under the best of circumstances, and aboard a pirate ship, far from any medical assistance, it could easily become a death sentence for both mother and child. Christopher stepped forward, his expression more hopeful than the others. "Captain, there might be another option. My sister lives in Nassau, runs a boarding house for sailors' families. She's helped with births before, and she's discreet. We could leave Emma there until after the baby comes, then decide what to do next." The suggestion had merit, Lionel had to admit. Nassau was a relatively safe port for pirates, and Emma would have proper care during her pregnancy and delivery. But the thought of leaving her behind, of not being present when her child was born, created an ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. "What does Emma want?" Lionel asked, realizing that in all their discussions about her fate, no one had actually consulted her preferences. The three men looked uncomfortable at the question. "We haven't asked her," Ryan admitted. "We thought it best to speak with you first." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion on deck, shouts and running footsteps that sent all four men rushing from the cabin. What they found was Emma collapsed near the ship's rail, her face pale as seafoam, with Lauren Smith kneeling beside her and several crew members forming an anxious circle. "She just fainted," Lauren explained, as Lionel dropped to his knees beside Emma. "One moment she was hanging laundry, the next she was falling. I barely caught her in time." Lionel's hands shook as he checked Emma's pulse and breathing, both of which seemed steady but weak. Her skin was cold and clammy, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and possibly poor nutrition. The pregnancy was taking its toll on her body, and the stress of her uncertain situation was clearly making things worse. "Get her to my cabin," Lionel ordered, scooping Emma into his arms despite the surprised murmurs from the crew. "Lauren, bring some water and whatever food Christopher has that might help settle her stomach." As Lionel carried Emma's unconscious form toward his cabin, he was acutely aware of the crew's stares and whispered comments. His public display of concern for Emma would fuel speculation about their relationship, but he found he didn't care. The woman in his arms had proven her loyalty and devotion, and he would not abandon her when she needed help. Emma's eyes fluttered open as Lionel laid her gently on his bunk, her green gaze unfocused and confused. "What happened?" she whispered, trying to sit up despite his gentle restraint. "You fainted," Lionel explained, his voice softer than he had intended. "You need to rest." "I can't rest," Emma protested weakly. "There's work to be done, and the crew already thinks I'm not pulling my weight." The words revealed so much about Emma's understanding of her precarious position aboard the ship. She knew the crew's feelings about her pregnancy, knew that any sign of weakness would be seen as confirmation of their worst fears. She had been pushing herself beyond her physical limits in an attempt to prove her worth, and it was literally killing her. "The crew's opinions are my concern, not yours," Lionel said firmly. "Your job right now is to take care of yourself and your baby." Emma's eyes filled with tears at his words, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked. "I know what they're saying about me," she whispered. "I know they think I'm bad luck, that I'm going to get everyone killed." Maybe they're right. The despair in her voice cut through Lionel like a blade. He found himself reaching out to take her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. "They're not right," he said with quiet conviction. "You've brought nothing but good to this ship, even if some of the crew are too blind to see it." Emma stared at him in surprise, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "You don't really mean that." "I mean every word," Lionel replied, and realized that he truly did. "You've shown more courage and loyalty than half the pirates I've known. This ship is better because you're on it." Lauren Smith entered the cabin at that moment, carrying a tray with water and some of Christopher's special broth. Her presence broke the intimate moment between Lionel and Emma, but not before Emma had squeezed his hand in silent gratitude. "Drink this," Lauren instructed, helping Emma sit up against the cabin wall. "Christopher says it will help with the nausea and give you some strength." As Emma sipped the broth, Lionel found himself studying her face in the daylight streaming through the cabin windows. She was beautiful, he realized, though it was a beauty worn thin by hardship and worry. Her pregnancy had added a softness to her features, but it had also highlighted the sharp angles of malnutrition and stress. She needed better food, more rest, and freedom from the constant anxiety about her place aboard the ship. "Emma," Lionel said carefully, "we need to discuss your situation. The crew has concerns about your pregnancy, and we need to make some decisions about your future." Emma's face went pale again, and she set down the bowl of broth with trembling hands. "Are you putting me ashore?" The fear in her voice was heartbreaking, and Lionel realized that Emma viewed being left at a port as abandonment rather than rescue. She had come to see the Crimson Serpent as her home, despite all its dangers and uncertainties. "That's one option," Lionel said honestly. "Christopher has a sister in Nassau who could care for you during your pregnancy and help with the birth. You'd be safe there, with proper medical attention and decent food." "And after the baby is born?" Emma asked quietly. It was the question Lionel had been dreading, because he didn't have a good answer. A woman with a newborn infant would find it nearly impossible to support herself in a place like Nassau, especially without family connections or significant money. She would be vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, possibly forced into prostitution or other degrading work simply to survive. "We would figure something out," Lionel said, though he knew the words sounded inadequate. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I understand why the crew wants me gone," she said. "A pregnant woman on a pirate ship is nothing but trouble. But this ship is the only home I have now, and you people are the only family I know. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay and face whatever comes." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Lionel to confront the choice he had been avoiding. Emma was offering to stay despite the risks, despite the crew's hostility, despite the very real dangers her pregnancy would create. She was choosing them over safety, loyalty over comfort, and the courage of her decision took his breath away. Before Lionel could respond, Ryan White appeared in the cabin doorway, his expression urgent. "Captain, We've got ships on the horizon, 3 naval vessels, flying British colors, and they're heading straight for us. The news sent a jolt of adrenaline through Lionel's system. 3 ships meant serious trouble, possibly a coordinated effort to trap them. He leaped to his feet, his mind already calculating distances and escape routes. "How long before they reach us?" he demanded. "2 hours, maybe less if the wind picks up," Ryan replied. "They've got the weather gauge, and they're moving fast." Lionel's mind raced through their options. The Crimson Serpent was fast, but not fast enough to outrun 3 naval vessels in open water. They would need to use cunning rather than speed, perhaps lose themselves in the maze of small islands and hidden coves that dotted this part of the Caribbean. "Get the men ready for a running fight," Lionel ordered. "Secure everything that can be secured and prepare for some hard sailing. We're going to need every advantage we can get." As Ryan hurried away to carry out his orders, Lionel turned back to Emma, who was struggling to get out of the bunk despite Lauren's protests. "You need to stay here," Lionel told her firmly. "It's the safest place on the ship during a battle." "I can help," Emma insisted, though her pale face and shaking hands suggested otherwise. "I can tend to the wounded, or help with the rigging, or—" "You can help by staying alive," Lionel interrupted, his voice harsh with worry. "If those ships catch us, if we have to fight, I need to know you're protected. Promise me you'll stay in this cabin no matter what happens." Emma stared at him for a moment, reading the fear and desperation in his eyes. Finally, she nodded. "I promise, but Lionel—" She paused, using his first name for the first time since coming aboard. "Come back to me. Whatever happens out there, find a way to come back." The words hit Lionel with unexpected force, revealing depths of feeling that neither of them had acknowledged before. In that moment, with danger approaching and time running out, all pretenses fell away. Emma cared for him, not just as her protector or captain, but as a man she had come to love. And he loved her in return with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "I will," he promised, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Take care of our baby until I return." The possessive pronoun slipped out without conscious thought, but Emma's sharp intake of breath told him she had heard it. Their eyes met for a moment that seemed to last forever. "Jai." A silent acknowledgement of feelings that had been building for months but never spoken aloud. Then Lionel was gone, rushing onto the deck to face the greatest challenge of his career as a pirate captain. The 3 naval vessels were clearly visible now, their white sails billowing as they closed the distance with deadly efficiency. These were not the usual patrol boats they had been dodging, but ships of the line, heavily armed and crewed by experienced naval officers who knew their business. "They're trying to box us in," Donald observed, pointing to the formation the ships were maintaining. "One coming straight at us, the other 2 spreading out to cut off our escape routes." Lionel studied the approaching vessels through his spyglass, noting their positions and the skill with which they were maneuvering. This was not a chance encounter, but a carefully planned trap, which meant someone had provided the naval authorities with detailed information about the Crimson Serpent's location and likely course. The realization sent a chill through Lionel's blood. Someone had indeed betrayed them. But it wasn't Emma. While she had been praying for their safety and demonstrating her loyalty, the real spy had been feeding information to their enemies. The irony was bitter and potentially fatal. "All hands on deck," Lionel shouted, his voice carrying across the ship. "We've got a fight coming, and I need every man at his best." The crew responded with the practiced efficiency of experienced pirates, each man moving to his assigned position without hesitation. Weapons were distributed, cannons were loaded, and the ship's rigging was adjusted for maximum speed and maneuverability. Whatever their feelings about Emma's pregnancy, the crew knew how to work together when their lives were on the line. As the Crimson Serpent began its desperate flight, Lionel found his thoughts returning again and again to Emma, alone and frightened in his cabin. He had promised to return to her, but as the naval ships closed in with relentless precision, that promise seemed increasingly difficult to keep. The woman who had shown him such unexpected love and loyalty might lose everything because of his choices and his enemies. But Lionel Jones had not survived years as a pirate captain by giving up in the face of impossible odds. As the first cannon shots echoed across the water, he began to formulate a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. Either way, it was their only chance of survival, and more importantly, their only chance of protecting the woman and unborn child who had become the most precious treasures in his dangerous world. The next hour passed in a blur of cannon fire, shouted orders, and desperate maneuvering as the Crimson Serpent fought for its life against overwhelming odds. Lionel's plan had been audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to outrun the naval vessels, he would use their own coordination against them by sailing directly into the gap between two of the ships, forcing them to hold their fire for fear of hitting each other. The gambit had worked, but barely. The Crimson Serpent had taken significant damage from the brief exchange of cannon fire, and several crew members were wounded. Worse, their escape had been only temporary. The naval ships were still pursuing them, and the damage to their rigging was slowing them down with each passing minute. "We're not going to outrun them," Ryan reported grimly as he joined Lionel at the wheel. "The mainmast is cracked, and we're taking on water from that hit below the waterline." Lionel nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. They needed a place to make repairs and tend to their wounded, somewhere the larger naval vessels couldn't follow. His mind went to a small cove he knew about, hidden among a cluster of uninhabited islands about 10 miles to the southeast. It was risky, potentially trapping them if the naval ships found the entrance, but it was their only real option. "Change course for Devil's Pocket," Lionel ordered, referring to the hidden cove by the name his crew had given it. "Signal the men to prepare for a beach landing, if necessary." As the ship altered course, Lionel's thoughts turned to Emma, still confined to his cabin as the battle raged around her. He had heard no sounds from that direction during the fighting, which he hoped meant she was following his orders to stay hidden and safe. But he knew the terror she must be experiencing, trapped and helpless, while the fate of everyone she cared about was decided by cannon fire and seamanship. The entrance to Devil's Pocket was treacherous under the best of circumstances, requiring precise navigation between hidden rocks and coral reefs. With a damaged ship and pursuing enemies, the approach became a nightmare of split-second decisions and calculated risks. But Lionel had made this passage before, and his crew trusted his skill implicitly. "There," Christopher called from the bow, pointing to the narrow gap between two towering rock formations. "I can see the entrance." The Crimson Serpent limped through the passage with barely inches to spare on either side, her damaged hull groaning with every wave. Behind them, the naval vessels had stopped their pursuit, unwilling to risk their larger ships in the dangerous waters. For the moment, they were safe, but Lionel knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The hidden cove was exactly as Lionel remembered it, a perfect natural harbor surrounded by steep cliffs and dense vegetation. Fresh water flowed from a small waterfall at the far end, and the beach was suitable for careening the ship if major repairs were needed. It was a pirate's paradise, which was exactly why Lionel had never shared its location with anyone outside his most trusted crew. "Get the wounded ashore," Lionel ordered as soon as the anchor was dropped. "Set up a camp on the beach and start assessing the damage to the ship. I want to know how long we'll need to make her seaworthy again." As his crew began the complex process of establishing their temporary base, Lionel finally allowed himself to return to his cabin and check on Emma. What he found there stopped him cold in the doorway. Emma was not alone. Lauren Thompson, another of the few women among his crew, was kneeling beside the bunk where Emma lay, her face pale and drawn with pain. The smell of blood was heavy in the air, and Emma's dress was stained with dark patches that told a story Lionel didn't want to believe. "What happened?" he demanded, rushing to Emma's side. "The baby," Lauren said quietly, her voice thick with grief. "The stress, the cannon fire, the fear. It was too much. She started bleeding about an hour ago." Emma's eyes fluttered open at the sound of Lionel's voice, and the pain he saw there nearly brought him to his knees. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I tried to hold on. I tried to keep the baby safe, but—" "Don't apologize," Lionel said fiercely, taking her hand in both of his. "This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." But even as he spoke the words, Lionel knew that Emma blamed herself for the loss. The stress of her uncertain position aboard the ship, the crew's hostility, the constant fear of being abandoned, all of it had contributed to this tragedy. And ultimately, the responsibility was his for allowing the situation to continue without resolution. Lauren caught his eye and shook her head slightly, a gesture that confirmed Lionel's worst fears. Emma was losing the baby, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. In this remote cove, far from any medical assistance, they could only make her as comfortable as possible and hope she survived the ordeal. The next 24 hours were the longest of Lionel's life. While his crew worked to repair the ship and keep watch for pursuing naval vessels, he remained at Emma's bedside, holding her hand through the worst of her pain and grief. Lauren and Christopher took turns helping with her care, but Lionel refused to leave her side for more than a few minutes at a time. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to speak, other times lost in fevered dreams that made her cry out for people and places from her past. During her clearer moments, she spoke about the baby she had lost, the child she had never had a chance to hold or name. "I dreamed about what the baby would look like," she whispered during one of these lucid periods. "I thought maybe it would have your eyes, strong and determined, or maybe my mother's hands, gentle and capable of creating beautiful things." The words cut through Lionel like a blade, revealing the depth of Emma's feelings and the future she had been imagining for them. She had not just been carrying a child, but carrying hope for a different kind of life, a family that could exist even in the dangerous world they inhabited. "We'll have other chances," Lionel said, though the words felt inadequate in the face of their current loss. Emma smiled sadly, her hand tightening slightly on his. "Will we? Or will this be the only time we're honest about what we mean to each other?" The question forced Lionel to confront truths he had been avoiding. His feelings for Emma had grown far beyond simple attraction or protective instinct. She had become the center of his world, the person he thought about first upon waking and last before sleep. But acknowledging those feelings meant accepting vulnerability in a life that punished weakness without mercy. "I love you," he said quietly, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his lips. "I should have said it sooner, should have made my intentions clear from the beginning. Maybe then none of this would have happened." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for months, but I was afraid to hope for something so impossible." Their confession, born from tragedy and loss, created a bond between them that was stronger than any they had known before. As Emma slowly recovered from her miscarriage, Lionel found himself making plans for a future that included her as more than just a passenger or servant aboard his ship. The repairs to the Crimson Serpent took 3 days, during which time Lionel's crew demonstrated a loyalty and efficiency that reminded him why he had chosen each of them. Ryan White supervised the work on the damaged mast, while Donald Diaz led a team that patched the holes in the hull. Christopher Williams kept everyone fed with fish caught in the cove's clear waters. And even Lauren Smith contributed by standing watch and helping with Emma's recovery. But it was Raymond Jackson who provided the most unexpected support. The gruff pirate, known more for his skill with weapons than his sensitivity, approached Lionel on the second day with something wrapped in a piece of sailcloth. "Captain," Raymond said awkwardly, "I made this for the baby before we knew what would happen. I thought maybe Emma would want to have it as a remembrance." Inside the cloth was the small wooden cradle Raymond had been crafting in secret, carved with intricate designs that showed far more artistic skill than anyone had suspected he possessed. It was a work of love and hope, created for a child who would never sleep in it. When Lionel showed the cradle to Emma, she wept openly for the first time since losing the baby. But they were healing tears, the beginning of a process that would allow her to grieve properly and eventually move forward. "Tell Raymond thank you," she said, cradling the small wooden bed against her chest. "Tell him it's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." That evening, as the crew gathered around a fire on the beach to share a meal and plan their next moves, Lionel made an announcement that surprised everyone. "When we leave this place," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "Emma will be traveling as my wife, not as a servant. Anyone who has a problem with that arrangement is welcome to find another ship." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of waves lapping against the shore. Then Ryan White stood up, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "About time, Captain," he said simply. "The woman's have been good for you, and good for this ship. Anyone with eyes can see that." One by one, the other crew members voiced their agreement, even those who had been most suspicious of Emma's presence. The loss of her baby had somehow transformed their perception of her from a burden to be tolerated into a member of their strange family to be protected. The wedding ceremony, such as it was, took place the next morning on the beach of Devil's Pocket. With no ordained minister available, Ryan White performed the service using a combination of maritime tradition and improvised vows that seemed more meaningful than any formal religious ceremony could have been. Emma wore a dress that Lauren Thompson had crafted from salvaged silk, simple but elegant in its design. Lionel had traded his usual rough clothing for the finest garments in his sea chest, a blue coat that had once belonged to a captured naval officer and boots polished to a mirror shine. The crew stood as witnesses, their faces reflecting a mixture of joy and solemnity that acknowledged both the celebration of love and the recent loss of life. Christopher Williams had prepared a special feast from their limited supplies, while Raymond Jackson presented Emma with a simple ring carved from whalebone, its surface smooth and white as pearl. Do you, Lionel Jones, take this woman to be your wife, to protect and cherish through storm and calm, in wealth and poverty, until death parts you from this world? Ryan asked, his voice formal despite the informal surroundings. I do, Lionel replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. And do you, Emma Evans, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him through danger and safety, in sorrow and joy, until the sea claims you both? I do, Emma said, her voice strong despite the tears on her cheeks. Then by the power vested in me by wind and wave, and witnessed by this crew who sails under the same flag, I pronounce you husband and wife. May fair winds fill your sails, and may your love weather any storm. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and sweet, a promise of healing and hope after so much pain and loss. The crew cheered and threw their hats in the air, celebrating not just a wedding, but the formation of a new kind of family aboard their ship. That night, as the Crimson Serpent prepared to leave Devil's Pocket and return to the open sea, Lionel and Emma stood together at the ship's rail, watching the stars reflect on the calm water of the cove. What happens now? Emma asked, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. Now we sail, Lionel replied. We find new adventures, new challenges, new reasons to be grateful for each day we have together. And if I become pregnant again? The question hung between them, loaded with hope and fear in equal measure. Lionel turned to face his wife, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Then we'll face that challenge together, as we'll face everything else. But this time there will be no doubt about where you belong or how much you are wanted. This ship is your home now, and this crew is your family. Emma smiled, the first truly joyful expression Lionel had seen on her face since the loss of their baby. I never thought I could be happy living this kind of life, she admitted. But with you, I think I could be happy anywhere. As the Crimson Serpent sailed out of Devil's Pocket and into the vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea, Lionel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The test he had devised to determine Emma's loyalty had revealed far more about his own heart than about her intentions. Her midnight prayers for their safety had shown him a depth of love and devotion that he had never expected to find in his dangerous world. The loss of their first child had been a tragedy that would always mark their relationship, but it had also forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. They had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged not broken, but united in their determination to build something beautiful together. The crew's acceptance of Emma as their captain's wife represented more than just tolerance of an unusual situation. It was recognition that love and loyalty could exist even in the harsh reality of pirate life, that families could be formed not just by blood, but by choice and commitment. 6 months later, the Crimson Serpent sailed into the harbor at Nassau, her holds full of treasure from a successful raid on a Spanish treasure fleet. The crew was in high spirits, looking forward to spending their shares of the prize money on the pleasures that the pirate haven had to offer. But for Lionel and Emma, the arrival in Nassau held a different significance. Emma was pregnant again, her condition carefully monitored and protected by every member of the crew. This time, there was no question about her place aboard the ship or the support she would receive from her unusual family. Christopher Williams had become an expert in preparing foods that would help with morning sickness, while Lauren Thompson had sewn an entire wardrobe of maternity clothes from the finest fabrics they had captured. Even the most hardened pirates among the crew showed a protective tenderness toward Emma that would have amazed anyone who knew their fearsome reputations. "Are you nervous?" Lionel asked as they prepared to go ashore for Emma's appointment with the midwife Christopher had recommended. "A little," Emma admitted, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "But not the way I was before. This time I know I'm not facing it alone." The midwife, a capable woman named Deborah Ramos, who had delivered dozens of babies for the wives and daughters of Nassau's pirate community, pronounced Emma and the baby healthy and strong. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks," she predicted after her examination. "And this one's a fighter, just like its parents." As they walked back toward the harbor, Emma suddenly stopped and turned to face Lionel, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about what we'll name the baby," she said. "If it's a bush, I'd like to call him Raymond, after the man who made that beautiful cradle. And if it's a girl, maybe Hope, because that's what this child represents to me." Lionel felt his throat tighten with emotion. The names Emma had chosen honored both their lost child and the crew that had become their family, while looking forward to a future filled with possibility. "Those are perfect names," he said, pulling her into his arms despite the curious stares of passers-by. "Whatever this child becomes, it will know it was born into love." As they stood there in the dusty street of Nassau, surrounded by the sights and sounds of one of the most notorious pirate ports in the Caribbean, Lionel marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The wealthy pirate captain, who had once tested a pregnant servant's loyalty, had discovered something far more valuable than any treasure. A love that could survive loss, suspicion, and the constant dangers of life on the sea. Emma's midnight prayers for their safety had been answered in ways she could never have imagined. The crew she had prayed for had become her protectors and family. The ship she had blessed had become her home. And the man she had loved in secret had become her husband and the father of her children. The test that had begun with deception and suspicion had ended with truth and trust. Emma had proven her loyalty not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through quiet acts of love and devotion that spoke louder than any words. She had chosen to stand with them when she could have betrayed them, to pray for them when she could have cursed them, to love them in when she had every reason to hate them. As the sun set over Nassau Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the colors of their ship's flag, Lionel and Emma Jones walked hand in hand toward their future. Behind them, the Crimson Serpent rode at anchor, her crew preparing for another voyage into the unknown waters of the Caribbean. But whatever adventures lay ahead, whatever storms they might face, whatever enemies might pursue them, they would face them together. The pregnant servant, who had once knelt in prayer for a ship full of pirates, had become the beloved wife of their captain, and her prayers had been answered in the most unexpected and wonderful way possible. The test was over, but the love it had revealed would last forever, as enduring as the sea itself and as constant as the stars that guided them through the darkness toward whatever tomorrow might bring.